So welcome everybody and thank you for being here and giving up time on a Saturday to be part of a discussion and experience about leadership. It's really great to have everybody here. I'm Jean East and I'm a co-member of the Loretto community since 1983 and recently retired as a professor and never retire as a social worker.
Right.
The topic of this workshop is leadership, and that topic was chosen. I think initially I was asked by the activities committee here in Denver if I would work on this kind of a day and topic, and that followed, for those of you that are in the Loretto community, a discussion that had been part of our community groups back in 2017 that the Loretto Women's Network had written up about leadership. And we wanted to continue the conversation about what leadership is for each of us and what it means. This is really not about teaching about leadership. It's more today about creating a space to think about what each of us brings to the world at this moment in time. And I think this moment in time is, for lack of a better word, I could use many words, I'm just going to say the nondescript word interesting. And I think that for those of us in the Loretto community, we're in a process of evolution, and I'm not sure that that evolution isn't occurring everywhere in different ways. So most of you that know me know that I've studied leadership for many years. I studied it in graduate school as a social worker, and really what I learned there was a lot about how to do management and administration. But as soon as I started doing it, I realized that I was missing something. Something wasn't quite right with just the techniques that I had learned. And so that led me on this quest that's been a quest for many years to figure out how to be in assigned leadership roles, but also figure out how to be a leader in my own life and in my immediate communities. And I was very much influenced by my feminist thinking that was first influenced by my mother, who many of you have known over the years, knew her, and then by my own study, and especially back in the mid-'80s when they were beginning to do research and look at the fact that women tended to make decisions more out of an ethic of care than an ethic of fairness. And that led me on to studying a lot of feminist ideas about how women do relationships and do leadership. The studies were comparing women and men, but for the men in the room, I would say that any of us can be practicing feminists in terms of working from an ethic of care, where we honor relationships, where we have moved in theory to transformational leadership, which is less about the person in the role and more about engaging all of us in a process, combining spirituality and servant leadership. And finally, today we're talking about really trying to deconstruct the word leadership altogether and not put the label on it that it's had, but talking about being leaderful. Now, I feel a little strange standing up in front of this group because everyone in this room has already done leadership. Therefore, you already know a lot about it. At the same time, a number of authors have said that leadership is one of the most complex social processes that we have. And when I think about it that way, not in a role, not in a person, but in a process, I think about the potential for always learning and growing in how we show up authentically in the world. And so today is about just an opportunity to be part of that process for yourself and share that with other people so that you can continue in your community work, in your organizing work, in your advocacy, in your organizations, in your families, to be leaderful. And we're going to go through that topic today and also link that topic to a very timely issue in the world, which is how we think about inclusion and difference, which is, I think, very important. So we're going to start with an opening reflection. So in your folders, if you want to open that up, you have an agenda on the left side, which I'll go over in a minute. And then on the right side, the first sheet there is leading from our sacred center. And we're going to share that together. So let's all take a deep breath and bring ourselves here today. We are called today to presence, a presence that brings our heads, hearts, and souls into dialogue with a community of learners. We are called today to explore with wonder the ideas of leading and showing up authentically in our lives and in our worlds. We are called to our sacred center. So as I light this candle to begin our day, I'd like you to just take a moment of silence. And think of one component of your life where you desire to take or be more leaderful. And when I say leaderful and leadership, I do not mean to take charge or be responsible for something. I mean just to show up as authentically as possible. This could be your friends, with your friends, your family. It could be about an issue you're working on, a committee, a community. Just take a minute and think about one place where you want to show up more authentically. And as you hold on to that part of your life, may today's ideas, experiences, and conversations bring a consciousness to leading your life. You have the agenda there, and we're going to start off with talking about some ideas about leadership. I'm going to follow up. I'm going to give a few kind of little mini talks and exercises that build on the TED Talk. And then we're going to move into making sense of our own identities, particularly our cultural identities, and understanding that work in terms of what's going on in the world today. So before we actually move into that next exercise, we wanted to mention a process that we would like to bring to our consciousness today. And that process is called courageous conversation. And other people call it models of inquiry. There's a number of people that have written about this idea of courageous conversations. And you have a handout that's behind your agenda that you can reference and take with you that talks a little bit about courageous conversations. I just want to say a word about that because you're going to be sharing at your tables. And as you do that, we'd really like you to be conscious of the following process. The courageous conversations start with generative and deep listening. So when other people are talking, we really want you to stay curious about what they're saying. You know, it's hard. I'm very guilty of, I've got my mind already running. And because I happen to be a kind of idea mind person, it's real hard to stop that sometimes. And so this idea that really I want to try and understand what someone's saying. You know how many conversations we're in where everybody just plops their idea down. Oh, I think we should do this. Well, no, why don't we do this? Well, now you had a good idea, but let me build on that. That's kind of often how they go. And in courageous conversations, you really stay with that curiosity first. So as you talk about your leadership symbol, as you talk about what leadership means, try and stay curious about what others are saying, what story they're telling. At the same time, you are processing your own thoughts and feelings. Am I getting bored? Am I trying to interject? Is this meaning to me or not? That just happens. And so just acknowledging that that happens in this process. So you're always doing what we call inquiry, which is listening, before advocacy, which is let me tell you what I think. So that's the first couple of steps. And then when you get into thinking about your own contribution to the conversation, I'm going to challenge us to think about how do we, as we're listening to somebody, think about the deeper meaning in what they're saying. What we call mental models, which is our worldview that lives in our head. What's their worldview as they're sharing their perspective with us? And I'm going to just give you an example. I'm going to use a Loretto example because it's part of a meeting that I've been in recently that has to do with Loretto and its new entity that's formed called Link, which is a new incorporation nonprofit that is developing itself within and alongside of the Loretto community. And we could be having a conversation about why people have decided to join this entity or not join this entity, right? And so we're hypothesizing why they're doing that or not. And I think when we can get into our mental models, we try and step back from that and say, instead of asking the question, why are they joining or not joining, what is the meaning? What's the meaning within this system, this religious community, that we have these entities at this point in time and people are making a decision about it? Not what the decision is, but what's the meaning and the structure behind that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you can just keep that little skill in mind today, as part of how we're going to talk with each other, is paying attention to people's meaning systems, and then being sure, and we'll build that time in, that you always get to reflect and debrief. Well, how did that conversation go for us? Was that valuable? Was that helpful? What were we missing? All of that. It takes practice to do this, but I think it can be useful, and we wanted to introduce that as part of today. Any questions that anybody has before we jump in? That? Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Francesca Gallarada. Some of you may have met her so far here. I met her through Lisa, and she's going to tell you about herself. And she's adding a lot of richness and helping and planning to what we've done today, and she's going to start us off.
of the reason that I wanted to be here with all of you today and talk about leadership is how life affects us when we are leaders. And I say when we are leaders because regardless of our position, we are always leaders. We affect change by the actions that we take on a daily basis. And it's important for me to make sure that I am able to share with everyone and to learn from everyone how we approach the world. And that's the work that I've been doing for the past 20 years. As a diversity practitioner, I've had the pleasure of learning about how people approach the world. And when we talk about being our authentic selves, I really look at as we approach the world every day as leaders, we have to bring who we are, our full selves to work, our full selves to our conversations every day. And how do we do that? How do we engage in these leadership conversations? Well, I started this journey when I was working with the Walt Disney Company about 20 years ago. And as you can imagine, the Walt Disney Company is a place where people come to work and love to play. Most people who work at Disney spend their free time at Disney, playing at Disney, and I became one of those people. I actually went to the Walt Disney Company to do my graduate work, and I thought, I am going to master the art of alienation at Disney. I thought there are 56,000 people working at the Walt Disney World Resort in Florida, and if people don't hate their jobs there, they don't hate their jobs anywhere. And to my surprise, people loved working there. They absolutely could not wait to come to work every day. So I made it my mission to kind of figure out what is it about being at the Walt Disney World Resort that people loved so much. And that's how I started learning about leadership. That's how I started really looking at when a good leader has the compassion, has the energy, has the motivation to make people want to follow them, they can inspire and change the world. But when a bad leader gets put in place, they can destroy the world. And it can be very easily done very quickly. And so one of the things we'll look at today as part of our journey is, what does it mean for me to be an authentic leader? What does it mean for me to lead head, heart, and soul? And I love talking about leadership in that context. But before we jump into that, I want to give you all a moment to reflect and do some of that inquiry that Jean just mentioned. And take a moment, and I'm just going to give you 2 quick minutes to think about, what is leadership to you? What does it mean? And here's some questions for you to think about. Okay. What is it? What does it look like when it's effective? What does it look like when it's ineffective? What did we learn? Where did we learn what leadership is? Where does that idea come from? And all of these questions are in your packet. In your packet, you have the PowerPoint slides, so you don't have to write them down. But is it from your experiences? Is it from your hopes? Is it from something you learned, something you witnessed? What is it like when you're exhibiting leadership behaviors? What do you like? How does that affect followers? And how does it affect you as a leader? Or how does it affect a leader? So take just a few moments and write down some of your thoughts, and then we're going to get together and talk about it in our tables, and then we'll talk about it as a larger group. So what I'd like you to do now is take your thoughts and share them with your table, but I want you to share one aspect of leadership, and I want you to share where that idea came from to you. Because we really want to remember that leadership is really about who we are as individuals when we show up as being our authentic selves. And so where our ideas come from are really important. So share again, okay, one aspect of leadership and where that idea came from for you. Go ahead and share that with your tables now. So what is leadership? We're going to ask one person to volunteer, not be voluntold like we discussed this morning. One person to volunteer from each table and share some of the rich discussion that you all had, because I know you were all had a chance to talk about some really interesting topics. So who would like to go first? And we'll talk a lot more later about where we get our ideas from, because that's fundamental to who we are. It's an assumption that we make that these things sort of come to us, and it's like they don't just happen through osmosis. We learn them from places. And so we'll talk a lot more about where we learn our ideas from this afternoon. I love the idea of storytelling. I think it's so important for us to remember we are all storytellers, whether we know it or not, or whether we believe it or not. How we project and how we share our thoughts really shares a great deal about how we view the world. Fabulous. Thank you so much. Who's next?
Like trying to get rid of the mental model we have of leadership.
Yeah.
How much Barack Obama got criticized for leading from behind. I mean, whole articles written on that, which says how strong these mental models are that we have.
I think that speaks back to what Martha and her table were talking about, right? Is if you have, when you think about leadership, you think about it in terms of positions and titles and structure. You don't think about being an individual as a leader. You know, when we talked briefly while you all were chatting, is everything that we do is leadership. Every single behavior that we exhibit that people are watching is a form of leadership. So it's important for us to value us, who we are, and acknowledge who we are, and not just the idea of you have this title, now you're a leader, or you make this much money, so that must put you in a position of power. And so it's not always about being powerful when you have the word, and how do you disassociate those terms when you're trying to talk about being an effective leader. Great, thank you so much. Yeah, bringing out someone's best self, and how do you do that? And how do you do that for yourself too? Especially when we're faced with everything that's happening in the world. How do you get up in the morning and go, I'm gonna be the best person that I can be, and know that what's happening in the world is sort of defeating that. Great, thank you so much. And taking a breath before we respond, right? That's the difficult piece, is making sure that we understand, that we're fully hearing what people are saying and not just what we're interpreting or what we think people are saying.
We assume that
Right.
they mean.
Yeah, because we're listening through our own filters, and we're going to talk about that this afternoon too. So I'm glad that you all brought that up. Fabulous. What do you think, Jean?
I think they got it.
Yeah. I think we're done here today. I think we're done. Fabulous. You all have covered really everything that we're going to talk about today in great detail, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jean today now, because what we want to do is put it in context of how do we lead from our head, our heart, and our soul.
So I just want to add a couple of comments before we take a break. And then we will come back and work with your homework assignment about a symbol. So I came to this leading with head, heart, and soul, as I said, after a lot of reflection about my experiences in leadership roles. And I see the three as very much connected. I see that, and you were saying this, I think, Sheila, maybe it was you, about, you know, how do you balance listening and yet have a vision and move things forward? You know, that constant kind of tension between the being and the doing of leadership in some ways. And so I've come to that if we can integrate these three components, head, heart, and soul, and I don't include body in there, some people do. I do think that's very important. I just didn't take it that far. That I think it gives us the possibility to do these things. The head being the learner, the person who is learning skills and ways of working with other people. The heart being the steward of relationships, and the soul being the meaning maker. So based on that, I wanted to present two ideas that sort of are foundational to this model. for me. The one is by Peter Block, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. I have one of his books over there. He says, if there is no transformation inside each of us, all structural change in the world will not have an impact on our institutions. Now, this is a very interesting comment, and I have thought a lot about this comment. Because as somebody who's been a social worker, been around community organizers, we take on policy, we go to women's marches, we do a lot of action to try and change the way the world is. And I don't dismiss any of that. I actually believe in it all, and I do it. And so then I'm struck with this idea that in addition to that, maybe, I mean, he's saying blanket without the internal revolution, we're not going to get the change. And I struggle with this idea. So I put it out there as you're thinking about it. But what it has led me to is understanding that there are all these other models that we use to try and create change in the world. And how much time are we spending on this conscious, internal, cultural shift model in changing the world? Now, I actually think justice and peace folks and religious communities do it better than most because we have that built kind of into our fabric. So how can we take that out to the rest of the world if we do it, and can we do it better? So that's the first one that sort of has undergirded my push and thinking to head, heart, and soul. And the second we've already mentioned, that leadership is doing, of course, but it's also being. And we need all these strategies for doing, but I think that we need new ways of thinking about leadership as being, because the construct that we have about this leader thing and this label that we put in there is very much the doing part. And I think what we can bring to the world is the being part. And I think that the world needs it now more than ever. So I think it's hard to step out of the Western patriarchal, normative, whatever other words you want to use, model. But I've come to, at least if I think of head, heart, and soul, that's my first step. So let me just say a little, building on the TED Talk, about that before we take a break. I mentioned in the TED Talk, I think this is just a fascinating piece of information, that the electromagnetic field of our heart is 60 times greater than our brains. Add that to that in quantum physics, we now understand that at the smallest level, atom and beyond, that it's actually not individual particles that make up the world. It's the waves and the relationships between those particles. So if you take those two things together, I feel like that leads us to relationships is what's going to change the world. Now, I don't just mean relationships with people. As I said, I mean relationships in a lot of different ways. So how do we bring that into what we want to present as leadership to the world? And I love this quote by Marianne Williamson from her book, Healing the Soul of America. Love, like fear, is contagious. Unlike fear, however, love has ultimate authority over the forces of the world. Now, I have a really hard time with that these days because there's so much fear. And I don't have a big answer for how we do that, except that we keep that present in our minds, because I feel like in some ways I've never seen as much fear as I'm seeing now. And maybe that's my age and looking back and so forth and so on. But what's hard in keeping this relationship heart piece in the center of our work is that our ego gets in the way. And one of the books that I have over there, I have a number of resources over there and some books that you can look at. And one of the books that actually some of the people in this room have participated in the leadership for women religious training that's going on. And they use a leadership tool in that training that's based on the work of the authors of that book, Bob Anderson and others. And they talk in there about how in order to do this work from a heart and perspective that we want, we really have to examine our needs to conform, achieve, and control. And I can talk to my own experience. I have, I struggle with the need to belong. And I can trace that back to being an only child and all kinds of things about how I can trace back my need to belong. But I have this need to belong. And sometimes that need to belong gets in the way. It creates a fear that can get in the way sometimes of being my best self. And so I think we all need to kind of look at this heart part. And it sounds easy and it isn't. And so I just put that out there to think about that. These relationships that we build, and I have this little diagram there, are multi-leveled. It starts with our relationship with ourselves. It moves to relationships with others, those in our immediate community, those we know, our family, our friends. It moves out to the larger community. So be thinking about how you show up in those. We're very good at showing up collectively in service and care, but are there other ways to be part of the human community? And when I say world, I include two things. One is the earth. So there's the world. There's all the world. Beth knows the world, works at the UN, knows the world. The world has lots of countries in it. There's the world. Then there's the earth and our relationship to the earth. And finally, there's our relationship to evolution. Where is our place in evolution? So when I talk about heart and relationships, I'm talking about relationships at all these levels. Souls. I talk about in the TED Talk about purpose and understanding our purpose, and that our souls are our meaning makers. And that for me, spirituality, not apart from religion, spirituality is a meaning-making process. It's helping us to make meaning of our existence and of the world and where we are in the world. And part of that comes back to reaching in and out through courageous conversations, not trying to be too over-identified with issues, although we do identify with the issues that we're passionate about, and we put a lot of our work into that, but thinking about our work as part of this meaning-making evolution. And how do we bring that into our world? So I'm asking now, we're gonna take a little break and shift gears, and we're gonna come back and have you work with a symbol that represents your sacred center. If you didn't get a chance to think about that, you can make up something, you can draw something or whatever, and I'll tell you what we're going to do with that. But I want to end this with una palabra. I want you each to think now, given where you are right at this minute and what you've heard, one word, una palabra, one word that is coming to your mind at this point in time. And I want to make sure you all write down your word on one of those pieces of paper. So one word, write it down. We'll share it when you come back. We'll take a 10-minute break. Una palabra. So the homework from the TED Talk was to think about one relationship that, and again, it could be a person, it could be an idea, it could be a symbol that represents your sacred center, the combination of your head, heart, and soul. And so what we're gonna ask you to do is share that at your table, take about 2 to 3 minutes for everyone to share. And the question you're answering is, what is the story of your symbol? And then we'll give you a little, after everybody's done that, we'll give you a little time to just reflect on that. Maybe somebody can kind of be a timekeeper. We have about half an hour for this. And then you're reflecting on the question, how does my symbol speak to my purpose? So that's your soul, your purpose. And that just follows with, how does my symbol represent my soul? So those two questions are related. And then you will share, everybody will share that with the group, what you want to share from your own reflection. And then we'll bring it back to the whole group and put some closure to that. Oh, we're blowing balloons now. Oh, that's your symbol. Oh, it's gonna be fun to see everybody's symbol. So in my talk, I used pansies as my symbol. It was interesting, it came to me because I was reading back through my journals, which I've had for years and years and years, and I realized that I often referenced this time as a child when I would go into the backyard, and we had a tree in the middle of the backyard, and my mother would plant, so it was shady, and she would plant pansies around that tree. And for some reason, I was called to sit there with those pansies as a child. And I think it represented my introverted self. I think it represented my connection with nature, which I have always loved, and flowers. I just had to ponder what that symbol meant to me in terms of my soul. I have a second symbol, which I brought today. It's a little statue of a Native American woman, and it was given to me as a gift from a mentor of mine, a teaching mentor, and it has a cross on the bottom, and it's, she's all bundled up, and I just kind of take her with me often, and I'm not even sure exactly how it represents my soul, but it has something about my purpose as being quietly present, which is part of me. And so it just helps me. So I think symbols can be really powerful in our lives and help us represent who we are. So at your tables, you're going to share your story with each other. If somebody hasn't had a chance to do that, maybe don't put them first and give them a little time to think about it, but share your stories and we'll check in as you're going along. Okay? So I would just ask that you've shared your symbols with each other, and I would just ask that you think about how you can bring that symbol or that relationship into all the work that you do, into your life going forward. How can it help you stay centered in being, not just doing? How can it acknowledge your strengths? And how can it embrace your vulnerabilities? For me, the pansies acknowledge the strength that I had somewhere in me to take a quiet moment to be in nature and to help me feel centered. And it embraced my vulnerability of doing that alone. And maybe sometimes feeling sad when I did that. So I think that we want to think about these symbols as representing all parts of us, our strengths and our vulnerabilities. What we're going to do as we end this is we're gonna ask you all to put your your symbols on these 3 poster boards with your little name on the sticky. They're right here on this table. So as we break for lunch, you can do that so everybody can see our collection of symbols or words or pictures, whatever it is. And so we'll put those there, and that'll give you a chance to look at other people's as we take a break for lunch. I think that we're very good at, especially again, maybe in this kind of community, of using symbols in our lives. We all create symbols and use symbols in many different ways. I think it's a gift that we have that, and I think it's a gift that a lot of people that are vulnerable don't have the luxury of having. They probably do, but they may have a symbol, but do they have the luxury and time to spend reflecting and thinking about it? And so I think it's a question we can elicit from others in our work, is helping them to think about how they have relationships with ideas or symbols or things that bring meaning into their lives. Oops, hit that by mistake. Because our soul work is definitely partly the work of our symbols. And I just want to encourage that you think about those relationship and symbol pieces. Francesca's going to tell us about her symbol. Then we're going
My symbol is a rose quartz elephant, and it was given to me by a storekeeper in Chinatown in San Francisco. And I was visiting Chinatown, and as full disclosure, I am part Cuban, part Chinese. So my father was from mainland China, my mother was from Cuba. And so I went into the store and I was looking at the God of Wisdom, and he looked at me and we had this great conversation for about an hour, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm interviewing for a job." And he runs away from me and he just leaves the store, runs to the back, and comes back with this elephant, and he says to me, "This is a symbol of strength, it's a symbol of wisdom, it's a symbol of luck, and it is a symbol of you." It really, to me, speaks to that I bind myself to people quite easily. So I think the elephant is also a very wise animal, and so I try to hang on to it to remember that we all have sacred wisdom, and that I may not recognize it all the time, but it's in there somewhere, and my goal is to look for it as often as I can. And I think it also touches on my vulnerabilities in the sense that it has become part of who I am, just in that someone recognized something in me that I wasn't seeing in myself at the time. And so I think that was really special, and so thank you for letting me share that with you.
Okay, so una palabra, one word, whatever, it may have changed since the word you thought of half an hour ago. But we're all going to go around and say just one word to close this time before lunch. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this next section, head, heart, and soul, with the head part, going back to the head part a little bit, before we move into the next piece. And I wanted to start that by talking about the idea of resiliency. It's a word we hear fairly often these days. We hear it in sustainability movements around resiliency. We talk a lot about it in social work, actually. We used to talk about problems, and now we talk about risks and resiliencies. There's all kinds of research on what makes people more resilient. And I think, again, as I've said, I think facing the challenges that we all face in the world today is requiring a lot of resiliency from all of us. And so I just wanted to say a word about that, because I think what's interesting about resiliency is that It's not a personality trait. You know, I think we sometimes say, oh, that's a really resilient kid, or that's a really resilient person. And I think that instead of that, resiliency is really something that we develop over time. And it comes about as we interact and negotiate with the world. And so I think it's important for us, both in our own lives and as we engage with other people in their lives, to help them think about how they've developed this resiliency in their lives over their lives, and talk about it. Ask them about those experiences so that they can claim them for themselves. And I'm just going to give you one personal experience from my childhood again. I was a very quiet, introverted child, and my father was always trying to get me to be more aggressive or assertive. And on the way to kindergarten every morning, the little girl that was with me in the car pulled my pigtails every day. And I'm sure I went home and complained about that. And he kept coaching me to hit her, you know, fight back, or pull her hair, or do something. I don't remember what he said. All I know is I didn't do it, because it kind of wasn't in my makeup to do that. And years later, I was in some discussion, I think, with my parents again, and my mother was part of that discussion, and I think it was a similar theme. They were trying to get me to be more or something. And my mother finally stopped in that moment, and she said, you know, Jean, she said, oh, I'm gonna read old Terry. She said, you know, you have as much courage as most people. Maybe you even have more because you're so afraid of so many things. And you continue to overcome that. And that message was, I think, maybe one of the first times I had this little inkling about resilience. Because I didn't see myself that way. I saw myself as being afraid of things. And I think that those experiences that we build over time, those moments when people help us point out our resilience, are really important. And we need that with each other right now. I feel like I need it every day when I watch the evening news. It's just so hard. So engaging our hearts and souls, but also our heads in this process of resilience, I think, is very important. So I just want to say a couple things about the head part of head, heart, and soul. I've already talked about the soul as our meaning maker, but where our heads come into that is our ability to do what I call zoom in and zoom out. As we walk through our daily lives, and as we look at what's happening around us, how do we take perspective of what's happening? And how do we see in the tiniest of details the big picture? So we look at day-to-day experiences that we have with other people, or that people are having in their lives. I know in my own life, in the work that I do with people that are vulnerable, and I listen to their stories, I'm always asking myself in their stories, how do I zoom out to the bigger picture of that story to help me in my advocacy work and other kinds of work, but also to help me in a vision for the future? It very much ties into the feminist principle of the personal is political. And by that, I think when the feminists first started, they were talking political in terms of systems and policies and all of that. I now take a much broader view of the word political. I think political is the combination of our social, cultural, economic, political, government, world, cosmos systems that all interact with each other. And so how do we take these events that we experience and broaden them out into a larger picture? And part of that for me is a concept of thinking about opposites So we think about opposites. Now I wasn't gonna be too political, but I'm reading Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened? And so it's very interesting because I'm reading that book and she does all this analysis of what happened. And it's all very, there was this event, this thing and that thing. And I'm reading that and I'm thinking about her at one end of a continuum and our current president at the other end of the continuum. And instead of thinking about them as opposites with this kind of head analysis, I'm trying to think about the ecology of those opposites. Like what, and by ecology I mean in nature, where there's a vacuum, something fills it in. And so what is the ecology of our current situation in the world right now that has created the current situation? How did we get to this point? And using our heads along with our hearts and souls to bring this systems awareness, not that you're always spouting it off, but that it's part of that learning and unlearning that I think is our head work. And we can get caught in the polarities instead of thinking of it as a system of relationships. So I think one of our challenges is to zoom in and zoom out and see the inner and outer world as connected and see these opposites as connected. And I would propose that as a way to keep unlearning as well as learning. The second thing I want to say, so it's it doesn't have a page number, Lydia, but it's in your packet after the PowerPoint presentation, and it's a yellow sheet of paper that says Strengths Finder Overview. So as we're using our heads along with our hearts and souls in our day-to-day work, I wanted to also share an idea about our strengths. And this was actually an unlearning for me, something I thought I learned and then I had to unlearn. So there's a whole movement out there, people have written lots of books about strengths, the strengths perspective, looking at people from their strengths. And there's a whole group of people who've been doing all this study and research about strengths as it relates to leadership. And one of the parts of that study is about our brains and how our brains work. And that our brains, from a very young age, create 4-lane highways and dirt roads. The 4-lane highways are the things we're good at. They're our strengths, and they continue to be reinforced whether we know it or not, because however that happens, that becomes our strength and that becomes the 4-lane highway. And the poor dirt roads don't change that much. So the premise behind this is that we really don't change that much. We really can't take necessarily all of the things that we aren't good at and all of a sudden make ourselves good at them. That really what we need to do is use our strengths and build on them and find our way in leaderful roles using the strengths that we have. And then of course you want to bring people together who have all the different strengths. So this is just a quick overview of their research where they identify 4 main areas of leadership strengths. Executing, which is you know how to get from point A to point B very well and you can implement something and make it happen. Influencing, which is you're very good at selling ideas, rallying people, winning followers. Relationship building, which means you are good at the working groups and mentoring and the glue that holds a team together. And strategic thinking, which means you like to analyze information, focus on the big picture, be strategic in the way that you think. And what I have come to realize, and I give you this because, and I actually want you to take a minute here and look at those 4 categories and see where you think your most strengths are. Where is your 4-lane highway? Now, you may have more than one, because you probably do, and you probably have some combination of things. But if you had to pick out one of those, what would it be? And I'm just gonna share a funny conversation that I had with Maureen O'Connell, who many of you know, some of you don't, but she's a community organizer at heart, done it all her life. She's a sister of Loretto. And we were talking about this group that we're working on together. And she said something to me about, oh, Jean, you know, you're so analytic or something like that. And I said, oh, about 4 of my top strengths are in strategic thinking. So, surprise, surprise. And I said, but you know what? I don't have any strengths in influencing. I mean, I may have a few, but not. And she says, oh man, I can get 50 people to a meeting just like that. And I said, I hate to make phone calls and try and influence people to come to a meeting. And what I have realized over time is that instead of trying to force myself into the box that I'm not good at, why not continue to develop the box that I'm good at? Not that we can't always learn and change and all of that. So just in a minute at your table there, just say, you know, where you see yourself, and think about how you can continue to develop that 4-lane highway. If you wonder what the last one under influencing is, it says woo. Woo means winning others over. Woo is winning others over. So take a minute, just.
What does intellection mean?
It means, it's like intellectualizing. It's like taking a concept and attaching it right away to a theory. Or taking an experience and attaching it to a theory, like I do all the time. You know, and of course some of that comes from your training. I mean, when you're trained in different ways, you develop these. But I do think that there's some truth to that. We do have these 4-lane highways. So yeah, share a little bit, just pick one and say, oh, I think this would be neat. I introduced this just snippet of this idea about our strengths, is that almost all leadership scholars, and certainly the head, heart, and soul thinking, starts with knowing ourselves. And whatever means one uses to learn more about themselves, I think is helpful. And there are, of course, many profiles and different kinds of things that you can look at. I like the idea of looking at strengths. That doesn't mean that we don't need to think about our vulnerabilities in our work, in our day-to-day work. But I think if we can understand that over time, and by the way, having strengths doesn't mean you can't do the other things. You learn to do them, right? Because you have to, because the job calls for it, or whatever it is calls for it. So you learn to do them. It's just that they're actually a little more work for you. And so I think that you balance that learning to do the things that you don't do as well, that maybe you feel more vulnerable about, with remembering that I do have these 4-lane highways that I can also bring to my work. So our heads allow us to learn and unlearn, and learning about ourselves builds our resiliency and carries us forward in this work. From a skill perspective, if you know what the dirt roads are, you ask for help. You know, you don't try and do it alone. And you look for working with people who blend with your strengths. I mean, I could put Sue Kenny on the spot for a minute and say, because we worked together for a long time, I would say we both have strong relationship skills. But Sue is much better at influencing than I am, and I'm probably more strategic than she is, just in general.
I just told her.
Oh, you did? And it was a great combination. And so I think that's one important thing about it. I think dirt roads also, if you look at Brene Brown's work and all of that kind of stuff, they're about our vulnerabilities. And some of our learning and unlearning is about, I like the phrase that I learned many, many years ago, long before Brene Brown was talking about it, when I used to teach supervision to social workers, about being competent and vulnerable at the same time. How do we do that? And if we can do that, I think then we're paying attention to the dirt roads. Anything else? Okay. We're gonna shift to soul leadership and inclusivity.
So what Jean has just shared, really talking about our head, heart, and soul, our relationships, and really understanding who we are as individuals is the foundation for looking at the world. So we create these systems, we create these meaning systems, and we start to think fundamentally, who are we as individuals? And what we're going to shift into now is that conversation of how have we created these meaning systems that we use to place judgment on the world? And I use the word judgment very intentionally because the word judgment has very negative connotation. You know, we judge things. But the reality is that when we talk about placing judgment on something, we talk about placing our values, our systems, our beliefs onto something else. So when we were picking out what we were having for lunch, we were judging things on the lunch table. Anybody disagree with me? And I use that example because I want us to really start looking at the language that we embrace and the language that we take into consideration when we're talking about who we are, when we're talking about our value systems, when we're talking about becoming stronger leaders and representing our authentic selves every day. Words have meaning, and the meanings that we place on them really help to shape the conversations that we have. So it's important for us to place value on words that bring meaning to us and reaffirm positive meaning in the words that we create or that we have negative judgments around. So I want to go back to our idea of these relationships that we have with ourselves, with each other, with the community, and with the world. These relationships that we have are based on a value system that we created and that we have created and continue to create as we interact with the world and with each other. We give meaning to something, we assign it a meaning through our beliefs. When we are in soul leadership, we are being very reflective. We are looking at the world through a particular lens, through our particular lens. And there's no right or wrong when it comes to how we view the world because it's something that we have been given, something that we have learned, and something that we have the opportunity to continue to grow or something that we have the opportunity to unlearn. So it's important for us to know that we're not placing judgment, and I'm going to use that word, on how we view the world. It's just observing that we have a particular way that we view the world. And understanding how we view the world is really what's going to open up those roads, and what's going to give us the opportunity to have dialogue with one another. So I want to say what we look at is something that I'm going to call cultural programming. And our cultural programming works a little bit like this. It's things that we have learned throughout our lives, things that explain how to be, how our value systems work, how our belief systems work. It defines our expectations of one another. And how we learn them are through different value systems. So we learn them from our family, we learn them from our religious institutions, we learn them from our friends, we learn them from the media, we learn them from all different aspects of life. Anything that we interact with, we have that opportunity to learn things. And they teach us different things, everything from learning how to walk, to how we treat our elders, to personal hygiene, and to solving math problems. All of these different things shape who we are. So how does it work? It works a little like this. You have this handout in your packet, it's called Cultural Programming. And I'm just gonna demonstrate really quickly for you. It starts like this. So at the core of your cultural programming is who you are. Okay, and I mentioned before, we used to call these people at Disney VIPs, very individual people, because there is no one in the world like you. You are unique, and you are a set of values and beliefs. And those values and beliefs come from different aspects of your life. So for example, you learn certain things from your family, from your religious institutions, from your education, from the media. All of these components teach us a particular way of viewing the world. So I will give you an example of my family. My father was from mainland China, and in China, they truly believe that education is what makes a human being the person that they are. It makes you special, it makes you unique, it makes you smart, it makes you successful. It is the foundation for being the type of person that you are going to be. In fact, when you are in China, depending on your lineage, it depends on the type of education that you get. And there's actual, in Chinese metaphysics, there's actual work that teaches the parent on how well educated that child will be, and the parent uses the Chinese metaphysics that they're being used, that they're shown to help educate the path of the child. So from a very early age, the parent decides that the child, what type of education the child is going to get, whether they're going to be technically trained, whether they're going to be trained in a university, whether they're going to, what path they will get. So for me, what I learned from my family was that education was critical to my success. I also learned very basic things from my family, like not to play with fire. I learned things like potty training. I learned things like how to walk. So they teach you basic foundations. Okay. I went to parochial school for 12 years. My religion was part of who I was, right? So part of who I am. So I learned things on how to view the world based on my Catholic upbringing, right? Same thing with my education. I went to school, I learned math, I learned how to read, I learned how to, skip school. I learned how, all of those different things that you learn when you're in an educational system. And same thing with the media. We are exposed to different types of media all of the time. And when we're children, we're also exposed to that long range. So we watch the news, we watch cartoons, we watch Sesame Street. All of those things teach us different values, different ways to approach the world. So when we look at this, what we find is how we are today as adults is a compilation of all of the things that we have learned throughout our lives. So I want us to take a few minutes right now, and if you can take out that cultural programming handout, I'd like you to take a few minutes and really fill out, you have a lot of different blankets in there. I want you to take just a few minutes and fill a couple of them out and really write about what are the things that have influenced who you are, and how have those influences affected your decision-making process? So take a few minutes. What has shaped your attitudes and your behaviors? And the instructions are on the sheet also. It's in your packet. Okay. So as you were writing them down, you might have encountered an instance where something that someone taught you conflicted with something that you learned from someone else? Did anyone have that challenge? Yeah, a couple of us. What happens is, as we go through life, we change, we adapt, we learn, we grow, and our values and beliefs may change. And when those values and beliefs change, what happens is we go through a process of growth and we become more resilient. It helps to teach us what we are learning and what we are developing. And it's a continuous change. You know, we talk about becoming our authentic selves. And I always find that the challenge with being my authentic self is I'm always learning and growing. And so that authenticity may or may not change based on my beliefs and my value systems. So as you are developing, the fact that these beliefs conflict is not a challenge, it's a growth opportunity. So it's a way for you to continue to enhance who you are and to learn more about yourself. So with one other person at your table, I want you to see, were there any similarities or any differences in the influences that have made you who you are today? And what were some of the most important sources of programming that you wrote down? And how do you go about learning someone else's programming? How do you take the opportunity to learn how other people are being influenced and how other people are learning and sharing values? So take a moment with someone else at your table, just one other person, and have that discussion. The questions are on your PowerPoint presentation. So our cultures, and I'll use the word plural, really shape our beliefs, our values, our perspectives, and our approach to the world.
I go back to the beginning that we were called here today to explore with wonder ideas for showing up authentically in our lives and in the world. And some of the ideas may fit for you, and some of them you may still be pondering, and hopefully all of them will land somewhere and carry you forward as you continue to do the wonderful work that you do. I'm gonna just end with another short quote. It's from one of the books over there. It's called The Lessons of Leadership from Social Justice. It's written of stories of justice movements and stories of people in justice movements over the years, a lot of examples from the civil rights movement about some of the work that we need to do to continue to make the world a place of right relationships. And it's actually a quote about hope that has been very helpful to me. And the quote is, "I don't understand human existence and the struggle needed to improve it apart from hope. But I'm not talking about naive hope that does not acknowledge how hard this road is and how hard this work is. But rather, I'm talking about critical hope, which acknowledges how destructive the absence of hope can be." And I try and think about that a lot, the difference between being naive, and which I can be at times, and being critical in my hope as we walk forward on this journey together. So thank you for being a part of that.